Hello, AP Euro students, and welcome to this podcast on the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of those satellite states and former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So here we go. So the first thing that you need to use to contextualize the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a brand spanking new leader of the Soviet Union, and his name will be Mikhail Gorbachev. So before we get into him, let's just first remind ourselves who some previous leaders were in the Soviet Union. So on this list here, the most important one to remember is Brezhnev. Some key ideas with Brezhnev is that Brezhnev stagnation, where the Soviet economy wasn't doing terribly well. We see elements of détente, but we're also going to see the elimination of détente when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979. And then when Brezhnev dies, we have two, honestly, pretty forgettable premiers of the Soviet Union, Andropov and Chernenko. Honestly, for our purposes, they're about as good as naming your cat after them. So for us, we gotta know, though, the last leader of the Soviet Union, and it is Mikhail Gorbachev. But I'm going to be calling him Gorby, because why? It's much more fun. So first, this guy is a radical. And by radical, I mean, he's young. Look at him. He's 54 years old. Yeah, that's really young for a leader of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko were all in their 70s. So being a young buck that he was, we know that younger people are more likely willing to reform the economy, reform politics. And that's the first word I want you to pop in your mind for Gorbachev is reform. The second thing to note is his birthmark on his forehead, that as he got older became more and more obvious because of his receding hairline. So Gorbachev is still, in fact, alive today. And here we go on how he's going to kind of accidentally hasten the downfall of the Soviet Union. So here's the economy that that Gorbachev inherited when he was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985. Effectively, it was failing in most parts of it. So if you were to go to a grocery store, and pretty much the thing you'll see are bare shelves. Very tough to find items that you need for your everyday life. The Soviet Union's economy was never structured around having ample amounts of consumer goods. Agriculturally speaking, they're experiencing multiple shortages. Additionally, why are they getting those shortages? Is because the Soviet system doesn't incentivize work. So he needs to figure out a way to actually make this failing economy not fail. So additionally, and politically speaking, Cold War tensions are at their height when he inherits the Soviet Union. So détente is not a thing anymore. We know again that was gone by 1979 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the United States and the Soviet Union are experiencing an incredible amount of tension, and that's further exacerbated by their incredible arsenal of nuclear weapons, which at this point, the Soviet Union has almost 40,000 nuclear warheads. So how is Gorbachev going to fix this? Well, he's going to have two answers. And yes, you're going to need to know the Russian words for both of them. So the first reform he will institute is called perestroika. And this is going to be his economic reform where he's going to restructure the economy. Perestroika essentially translates as economic restructuring. So here's what he needs to do. He needs to make the Soviet economy competitive and efficient. He would love to make the Soviet economy competitive on the international market as well. And in the end, if this all works, this would in fact increase the standard of living for average Joe Soviet citizen. So how's he going to do it? Well, look what's coming back. He's going to allow some free market capitalism and private ownership of businesses. Wait a second, your brain should immediately be thinking of the last time the Soviet Union allowed a little bit of capitalism into their communist economy. Yes, you got it. It is Lenin's new economic policy from 1921, which was meant to revive the Russian economy after the Civil War. Additionally, he's going to try and decrease the amount of command that's going on in this economy. So generally speaking, that is in fact a popular reform, but the way it's going to play out is not going to be terribly popular. So then he's going to really abandon the idea of a communist form of economy by not saying everybody's going to have a job and revoking universal health care, effectively privatizing it. And that's going to be immensely unpopular because the people who can afford healthcare at that point are going to be typically more wealthy ones. So, as you can probably guess by now, this isn't going to work. Perestroika is actually going to weaken the Soviet economy. Accidentally, but it does in fact further weaken it. So, by and large, when they try to compete with like the United States, West Germany on the international market, it is a complete bust. Additionally, the people who are getting wealthy are very few in number. There will be a few of them who will become immensely wealthy. They'll essentially become billionaires, and we will know them as the oligarchs, and they still run the Russian economy and Russian politics to the very day. But by and large, the average Soviet citizen actually saw a decrease in their standard of living because they're not having full employment, therefore they're losing their jobs. Bye-bye universal health care, and people are now actually hurting more than they did before 1986. Lastly, when he's instituting more market reforms, that inevitably is going to lead to inflation, the devaluing of your currency. And that means prices increase, and that inevitably also means food shortages. And in Russia, we know that also means, besides bread lines, folks, there are literally vodka lines going on in the late 1980s. If the Russians can't get their vodka, you know something is going to happen pretty darn soon. So, perestroika further weakens the Soviet economy. Unfortunately, we're not going to be watching these videos because it's kind of strange in this screencastify format. I apologize. Next one, reform number 2, and this is about political reform. Glasnost, which roughly translates as openness, transparency, whatever you want, but glasnost is the word you gotta know and the word that you will use on the AP exam if they do talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. So, first we had perestroika. So perestroika is the background, the context for glasnost. So now that the Soviet economy is restructuring, the next thing that usually happens is a political restructuring. So glasnost is going to be Gorbachev's attempt to liberalize their politics. And again, what do we mean by liberalize? We mean more freedom of speech. The possibility there could be more than one political party in the Soviet Union. Let's see if that happens. And additionally, what recently happened was the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl, Ukraine, 1986, the worst nuclear meltdown in human history. And the Soviet Union tried to cover it up, and eventually when news gets out that there was a nuclear meltdown that affects tens of thousands of people, this is going to add to calls for more transparency. So, here's what is in glasnost. 1. Effectively, they're going to try and reduce this opaqueness by allowing people to start criticizing the government. Flip Mr. Walters' toupee. Criticizing the Soviet government? What? Has that ever happened? Pretty much in any part of Russian history, let alone the Soviet Union? No! So, folks, think about give a mouse a cookie. When you give a mouse a cookie, what does that mouse want more? It wants more of the cookie. So effectively, what the Soviet Union to do is opening up the floodgates for criticism and eventually even more reform. Now we're going to start seeing foreign news services are going to have access to Moscow and the political system. This is fundamentally changing Soviet politics and also culture. They're not going to have a black market for blue jeans or rock and roll anymore. This is fundamentally a different Soviet society. So, what are the results of this? 1, as I mentioned, when you give the mouse a cookie, they want more. There's now going to be calls for full-on democratization. The D word in the Soviet Union. Full-on democracy. Let's see how far they get with that. Then, here's the reality. There are plenty of liberals who don't think Gorbachev is going far enough. Again, give a mouse a cookie, they want more. But then, there's even larger numbers who are still conservative, and they want to maintain the system they have always had since the 1920s. So effectively, Gorbachev is making an enemy out of most people. So what this will do is further hasten the Soviet decline. Now that they have a weakened economy from perestroika, now they've opened up the political floodgates with glasnost and their transparency. So now we're talking really late 1980s into the early 90s, and look at what Gorbachev will now be instituting. He is, in fact, going to institute some democratic reforms. For example, competitive elections. That means you have more than one political party on the ticket, and they won't be corrupt, in theory. So one-party rule is gone. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union is not the only acceptable political party. So then they take their legislative body and they televise it. Historically, all of the consortiums and the organization of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they were always secretive. They rarely, if ever, publicized what was going on in those meetings, especially the Politburo meetings, which is the highest level rank in the Communist Party. So now that we have these reforms going on in the Soviet Union, this is going to blur into the Eastern Bloc, those satellite states, and the republics in the Soviet Union. So basically, glasnost and perestroika are going to lead to nationalism in other parts of the Soviet Union. Now Ukrainians may want to have their own country. Poles, satellite state of Poland, want to have a fully independent country from the actual Soviet Union. So what's going to happen is ethnic groups are going to call for more autonomy and then flat out independence. So we're going to really look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, and more than just that. So additional reforms from Gorbachev. Foreign policy-wise, he wants to start engaging with the international community more. And what that means is two countries in particular, the United States and the UK, Great Britain. So the leadership of the UK and Britain at this time, for Britain, it is Maggie Thatcher, who we just covered, and of course, President Ronald Reagan of the United States. Both of these leaders were quite conservative, and they will both help usher in this new age in foreign policy. So again, always going back to this idea with the nuclear weapons, we see in the Cold War, it's this kind of ebb and flow on what's going on with the tension with the nuclear arsenals. So in the late 80s, they're going to start signing additional disarmament treaties. Are they fully getting rid of their nuclear weapons? Absolutely not. But they are significantly decreasing them. For example, the Soviet Union at its height had almost 40,000 nuclear warheads. Today, Russia has about between 5,000 and 6,000 nuclear warheads. So they do dramatically decrease them, but they definitely are not giving them up. Lastly, Gorbachev will pull the Soviet Union out of the incredibly unpopular war in Afghanistan. Man, I wish I could show this to you. I highly recommend YouTubing this. There's one of the other reforms that Gorbachev is doing. He's allowing international businesses into the Soviet Union. And you know what that means, folks? McDonald's and other fast food. Pizza Hut actually went to Moscow and they made an awesome commercial actually starring Gorbachev. So just go on YouTube and Google like Gorbachev and Pizza Hut commercial. It's fantastic. I don't want to show it to you because the audio gets kind of wonky when I do it in this format here. Okay. So again, Gorbachev is making all these reforms in the Soviet Union. Next, we're going to see if this is going to trickle in to the rest of Eastern Europe. Spoiler alert, it will. So Gorbachev's reforms, both glasnost and perestroika, are going to further increase the calls for flat-out autonomy and independence in these satellite states and republics in the Soviet Union. So, first country to talk about is Poland. And the word I want you to always recognize with Poland is solidarity, which will eventually become a trade union that will hasten Poland's transition to a democratic form of government. So, what's Poland looking like before Gorbachev is leader of the Soviet Union? It's not looking good. Like the rest of Eastern Europe, there are no consumer goods. Well, there are some consumer goods, but not that many. Again, shelves are generally barren in their supermarkets. Why? Because people don't really have a reason to produce a lot. They can't really make profit on what they are producing in Eastern Europe. Inflation is leading to high food prices, which means food shortages. So we see breadlines throughout the Eastern Bloc. Additionally, the Soviet Union is going to really emphasize the Polish government to maintain the Communist Party's supremacy. Remember, officially, Poland, since it's a satellite state, technically independent, but if the Soviet Union says jump, we know Poland will probably say how high. But an important moment, 1978, a new pope was elected. And folks, this pope does not have a... Okay, he does have a vowel at the end of his name, but he doesn't have the Italian vowel at the end of his name. It's the first non-Italian pope since the 16th century. They elected a Polish pope, John Paul II. And when he's elected, this is going to exacerbate these calls for Polish autonomy and independence. So his election to pope is going to increase Polish nationalism. So, now we get to the actual solidarity movement. Circle the term solidarity, you gotta know it. So, solidarity is originally a trade union inside of Poland. So effectively, I'll oversimplify this, but they're kind of like a political party, but officially political parties are banned, but essentially they tried to act like one. So, pretty quickly, they had a leader named Lech Walesa. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly because Polish is one of the most difficult languages in the world to know. A very popular electrician in this trade union. He's going to call for flat out Polish independence and ushering in a new form of democracy. So how does the Polish communist government respond? Well, they bring down the hammer to the best of their ability. So they do flat out ban solidarity, they put Walesa into prison, and then declare martial law to ensure there aren't any more protests or riots in Poland. Okay, this might work in the short term, but let's see what happens in the long term. Okay. So, Walesa, released from prison, and does he stop his movement? Absolutely not. And at this point, we're getting closer and closer to more reforms from Gorbachev. So Walesa's released in 83, Gorbachev's going to be in charge of the Soviet Union by 85, and then Glasnost and Perestroika are 1986. So, once that's going on in the Soviet Union, now that the Soviet Union is getting some market reforms, what do you think Poland wants? They want their own ability to have more liberalized economy, and additionally having more political autonomy, more freedom of speech. So again, what's happening in the Soviet Union is going to hasten the calls for more political autonomy and full-on independence later on. So, the Polish government eventually gives in. They officially recognize Solidarity as a political party, and then hold truly free elections. And when that happened, look who won the majority of seats in the Polish parliament. Yes, Walesa's Solidarity Party won the majority. Walesa is elected president in 1989, and effectively Poland is fully independent of the Soviet Union and is going to usher in effectively a democratic form of a government. So, what's nice about this is if you generally understood the chronology, the narrative of what happened to Poland, you can mostly copy and paste it to other satellites in Eastern Europe. So we're going to see a similar chronology with Hungary, with Czechoslovakia. So as long as you got one down, you can kind of copy and paste. So what's going on with Hungary? First, remember what happened in Hungary in 1956. They attempted to break free of a totalitarian form of communism, but Khrushchev brought down the hammer and violently crushed the 1956 rebellion. Well, what's going to happen now in 1989? Well, 1989 is not 1956. So when Gorbachev is initiating Glasnost and Perestroika in the Soviet Union, the Hungarian Communist Party is going to be more likely to be reforming itself. So when there are protests in Hungary for similar liberalization policies, the Hungarian Communist Party does in fact bend to the will of the people, and officially the Communist Party dissolves itself and they allow a multi-party system. So again, it's really similar to what's happening in the Soviet Union. You have initial calls for protests, and then the government's bending and giving into some of these reforms, and then full on often abolishing the Communist Party, or at least at the very least allowing a multi-party system. So in a symbolic moment, they take the body of the leader of the 1956 failed revolution, Imre Nagy, exhume him and give him a proper hero's burial in 1989. And that's an important watershed moment, showing that Hungary is in fact fully going into this democratic process. So another important moment, this is going to have implications for East Germany, is Hungary got rid of their border with Austria. Remember, Austria is essentially everyone's ticket to get to Western Europe. So if Hungary is eliminating their border with Austria, that means essentially anybody who is in Eastern Europe, they just have to go to Hungary, and then they can hop on over to Austria to effectively run to freedom in Western Europe. And this is going to precipitate the deconstruction of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. So a year after that, Hungary has full-on free elections, and they establish a democracy using a unitary parliament. So since then, Hungary is being ushered into more and more Western Europe. Officially, Hungary is probably closer to Central Europe. But when you join NATO, that's an important moment where you're becoming more aligned with Western nations. And additionally, they became part of the EU in 2004. So Hungary has generally been on that path toward democratization. But today, they've actually been pushed more right, and the current leader of Hungary is powerfully conservative and effectively is a strongman, authoritarian in a fashion. So post Cold War, we're starting to see this like ebb and flow between more democracy or more authoritarianism. Okay, next on the list is East Germany. Okay, so we know that after World War II, Germany was split up into 4 sections, but eventually it just came down to 2 sections. West Germany being democratic, and East Germany being a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Well, 1989 is going to change that. So again, what is our context? Perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev initiating these reforms, it's going to trickle in to East Germany. So Erich Honecker, who's been in charge of East Germany seemingly forever for most of the Cold War, who has historically been a hard-lining communist, he is going to eventually bow down to these reforms. Eventually. So the key moment, though, is when these East Germans are fleeing East Germany to Hungary to eventually get to Western Europe. And at that point, the floodgates are open. So now we have anti-government street demonstrations, protests. Does this sound familiar, folks? It should. And then Gorbachev sends Honecker an important message. Gorbachev told him, we will not send in the troops to support East Germany and put down these protests. And when he did that, Honecker had no choice but to do multiple things. 1, resign, and when he resigned, the new leadership is going to promise free elections, and effectively that also opens up the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November, 1989. Symbolically, probably the most important moment of the Cold War, and that effectively allows East Germans to travel west, but also it really opens up these Eastern Bloc of nations to Western Europe, and we really start seeing the foundations of communism beginning to collapse. And then, in another huge moment, David Hasselhoff arrives on the Berlin Wall, and he throws a legit concert on it. He's singing on top of the Berlin Wall while people are hacking away their own sections of it, and people in the United States are watching David Hasselhoff give a concert on the Berlin Wall. So, by 9th of November 1989, we're starting to see the Cold War effectively coming to its end, but it will officially last for an additional 2 years. So now that the Berlin Wall is fallen by November of 1989. That is going to lead to the reunification of Germany a year later in 1990. All right. Unfortunately, I can't play these for you. They are fantastic, especially this one involving David Hasselhoff singing On Top of the Berlin Wall. So please YouTube that if you have a little bit of time. YouTube David Hasselhoff, Berlin Wall. You will not be disappointed. Okay. As mentioned, what comes next? Well, it's German reunification. So that means East and West Germany becoming Germany. And the person to know is this receding hairline dude with the fantastic glasses, Helmut Kohl, who was initially the West German chancellor. So the reunification was started when France, Britain, US, and the Soviet Union met, and they all came to the agreement that Germany needs to be reunified. And it was essentially that simple. They take West Germany's former capital, which actually was in Bonn, Germany, and they move it back to Berlin because now it was not in like the Soviet sector in the heart of East Germany. So by 1990, Berlin is back to its capital, and effectively, Helmut Kohl is going to usher in this new age. All right. Last country for kind of like the fall of the Eastern Bloc is Czechoslovakia. And yes, we've already talked about Czechoslovakia. Yes, 1968 is the year to know, where the initial large protests where they're calling for a more democratic form of socialism, but that was also violently crushed by the Soviet Union. But 1989 is going to have a different outcome. So the Czechs call this their Velvet Revolution. So if you see the term Velvet Revolution, it's talking about their full independence from being a satellite state in 1989. So, what is their context? Well, we see that there are other parts of Eastern Europe are gaining full-on autonomy and independence from the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia is next. So, once again, we're going to see the same chronology as before. People are protesting in the streets, demanding for autonomy, independence, democracy, liberalizations. And initially, the government does resist, but eventually they will bow into the pressure. And the leader who comes to the forefront is this guy, Václav Havel. Not Dubček. Alexander Dubček was the leader of the 1968 attempted revolt, but Havel is going to be the guy to know for 1989. So being the leader of these revolutionaries, eventually, they have so much support that the communist government has no choice but to dissolve itself, and that will usher in a new series of elections. So an important moment, really again, symbolic moment, is the leader of the 1968 revolt, Alexander Dubček from Prague Spring, is going to hug Václav Havel on the balcony in the most important square in Prague, showing that connection between 1968 and 1989. So it was 89 to 68 upside down. And then at another moment, Alexander Dubček, after giving a speech, turns to the crowd and he's on this balcony again, and he starts giving them like a socially distanced air hug, showing that he's still with the people 20 years later. And again, you can kind of YouTube it. It's kind of an adorable moment of seeing this old guy doing like an air hug to the entire crowd. So, where do we get Czech Republic and Slovakia out of this? So initially, when Czechoslovakia is fully independent of the Soviet Union here, is not a satellite state anymore, they have Czechoslovakia as a country, but pretty quickly they realize that there are, again, national tensions between Czechs and Slovaks. So after Havel is president, they need to deal with these nationalistic tensions. So they came to the conclusion that simply separating these two nationalities into two states is in their best interest. So in 1993, there was a country called the Czech Republic and another country called Slovakia with the capital city of Bratislava. Not really fun fact, you should just know it. Czech Republic is not actually the name of the Czech Republic today. The actual name is Czechia. Yes, seriously. All right. I lied before. This is the last country, Romania. So what do we remember about Romania? Romania historically has been probably the most authoritarian communist state out of all of the eastern satellite states. And the dictator of Romania, Ceausescu, was effectively, they called him like a little Stalin in Spielvogel's book, and I think that's a pretty accurate representation. Highly authoritarian, bordering on totalitarianism. So, again, we're going to start seeing protests in 1989, and Ceausescu is going to try his darnest to brutally repress them. So he does have like a personal security force that is has his allegiance, but what we then see is effectively a coup in his own military. His military has pro-revolutionaries, people who want democracy and full independence of Romania, versus Ceausescu's personal security forces. Eventually, the protesters and the military capture Ceausescu and his wife, and they execute him by firing squad. So Romania, by 1989, is now going to become a form of a democracy. Oop, I think I skipped a slide. Did I? There we go. Whew, almost there. Okay, so 1989, we see all of these former satellite states in Eastern Europe are becoming independent. Well, now what happens to the actual Soviet Union, USSR? So what is our context as always? We know it, perestroika and glasnost, two reforms initiated by Gorby, and people want more liberalization. They want more democracy. They realize that perestroika has further weakened the economy. So, an important moment, 1991, Gorbachev was captured. There was an attempted coup d'etat from hardline conservative communists. Yes, I know that sounds a little bit strange, but yes, I'm going to use it. Hardline conservative communists captured Gorbachev, and they attempted to seize control of the government and remove all of these reforms, hoping to bring it back to something more similar to what Brezhnev had. Well, the president of the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin, who became a pretty popular figure at this point, he comes to Gorbachev's defense and effectively has him released from being prisoner. And at this point, Yeltsin becomes actually the most prominent figure in Russian politics. So, after these states are now fully independent, the Soviet republics, the actual republics inside of the Soviet Union, declared their independence. So Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine was in September of 1991. They full-on declare themselves independent. So if you don't have republics in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you don't really have a union anymore. So the official dissolution of the Soviet Union on actually Christmas Day, December 25th, Gorbachev gives a speech on television saying, "At this moment, I resign, and tomorrow the Soviet Union will be gone." The Soviet Union, especially their legislature, dissolved itself, and they created a new Russian republic, which will eventually be known as the Russian Federation, which is the official name of Russia. And Yeltsin is going to remain president of this new country. So 1991, the year I was born, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved.
December 25th.
Okay. So, almost there. So now that we have new country, Soviet Union has fallen, what happens next? So the guy to know for post-Soviet Russia, well, the first one's going to be Boris Yeltsin, and the second one will be the current strongman of Russia, Vladimir Putin. So Boris Yeltsin, he effectively wants to bring the former Soviet Union and make it into a more westernized nation. How does he do it? He wants to go full on, full speed, and we're going to call this shock therapy. He's going to usher in this capitalistic society, trying in a blink of an eye. We'll see how that is going to affect them. So his rush to capitalism, we'll call it shock therapy. Thinking like you're in the Adirondacks, you dig a hole, and you get a chainsaw and cut a hole in the ice, and you jump into that water. That's the feeling that the former Soviets, the Russians, will now have, calling it shock therapy. So he's going to help write a new democratic-ish constitution for Russia that eventually Vladimir Putin's going to have significantly amended so he can effectively be president forever. But that's more recent stuff. So other issues that he needs to deal with is there are still nationalist tensions inside of Russia. Yes, a lot of them have been assuaged since the former Soviet republics have been independent, but there are still a few groups that do not have their own country. And one of them is called Chechnya, made up of Chechens who were generally Muslim. And historically, they have wanted more independence or more autonomy and possibly full-on independence. And they're going to fight multiple wars against the Russian military. And most recently, Chechen separatists are actually fighting into the early 2000s. So this is actually still a point of tension for Russia itself. So again, with Boris Yeltsin, you just kind of need to associate the idea of shock therapy with him, creating a new Russian Federation out of the former Soviet Union, and you'll be good to go. So again, last thing I love talking about with Boris Yeltsin, but you can't really do it in this podcast format. Boris Yeltsin, the guy was effectively rarely sober. So when he would be giving these like important speeches, he'd be meeting these foreign dignitaries. The guy was drunk. And there's tons of videos of him just giving these slurred speeches, falling over, passing out at tables. It's just highly entertaining. So just Google or go on YouTube and Google Boris Yeltsin drunk, and you'll just find all these compilations of Boris Yeltsin being drunk, and it's just highly entertaining. All right, so I think that is a good place to stop. Again, reviewing what we just covered is understanding why is the communism in Eastern Europe falling? It's because of these initial reforms created by Mikhail Gorbachev, Glasnost and Perestroika, which hastened the calls for more democracy and a better economy. And from there, we saw a pretty similar chronology in, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, of people protesting in the streets, and eventually the government trying to crush them, but realizing it's futile at that point, and then allowing these protests to be successful and effectively dissolving their communist parties, allowing multi-party states, and eventually having a proper democratic parliament. So get that chronology down, and you'll be all set for this set of notes. So thanks for listening. I'll see you later.